Abijah is treated as something of a footnote in Kings, but here in Chronicles he's given an entire chapter, and it deals almost exclusively with this one conflict he had with Jeroboam, the king of the rebel north. And Abijah is going to give this speech to the armies of Israel, reminding them of their covenant with God, and he accuses Jeroboam of rebelling against God's appointed leaders in the form of the Davidic king and the priests and Levites. And although Abijah and Judah are outnumbered 2-1 against Israel, they trust in God and prevail. And that's essentially all of chapter 13. And I mentioned this in the last video, but it's probably even more relevant today. I'm not going to go through all the notes, but I will make those available when I'm finished with Chronicles. But we're going to kind of go quickly today because I'm actually going to hit 4 different chapters today, which is much more than we've usually done up to this point. Now, the first thing we want to comment on is the brevity of Abijah's reign. He only reigns 3 years, which would seem to imply that there's something wrong with him or his reign. His assessment in Kings is negative, so the short reign wouldn't be surprising, but we get a completely positive story here in this chapter, and so that seems to be at odds, but we will pick this up again in the summary of Abijah's reign at the end of this section. So we will loop back to this point. I want to pick up down here with verse 4. Then Abijah stood up on Mount Zemaraim, that is in the hill country of Ephraim, and said, "Hear me, O Jeroboam and all Israel," and is going to launch into this speech. But we'll pick up with Lightheart in his commentary. He says, "The army of Judah is badly outgunned. That does not prevent Abijah from taking the high ground," literally. He ascends to Mount Zemaraim in the hill country of Ephraim and launches into theological trash talk. The place itself is a provocation. The name means Twin Peaks, and it is in the vicinity of Bethel. Bethel is one of the places where Jeroboam has set up his golden calves. Abijah stands on a mountain opposite Bethel and tells Jeroboam, Israel, and the calves themselves that they are not gods. And again, John Stone, he was drawing on his work here, and he's making that same point. And he concludes, "It seems that Abijah has massed his troops on the frontier just threateningly enough to provoke Jeroboam into armed response." And remember, Rehoboam had skirmishes. We get that at the end of the last section. But he was never able to put him away. And so the task falls to his son, Abijah, and he's going to complete that task this time. But continuing with Abijah's speech, he says, "Hear me, O Jeroboam and all Israel. Ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt?" And Lightheart writes, Abijah focuses on the 2 main institutions of the Davidic kingdom, the monarchy and the Levitical priests who serve in the temple. He begins with "hear," speaking from a mountain, calling Israel to hear. Abijah reminds us of Sinai and of Moses' call to Israel. "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one." And that's Lightheart's translation of Deuteronomy 6:4. It is a meaningful opening. The northern kingdom has forsaken Yahweh. They have not kept the first word. They have not loved the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength, or worshipped him as the one God of heaven and earth. They do not have the right to call themselves Israel, the people of Yahweh, the people of the Shema, the one people who serves the one God with a single heart. In moving down, Lightheart notes here, with other commentators, that Abijah's speech has this modified chiasm. But there's one notable thing about it, and that's that, as you can see here, there's no B prime. So there's no matching element to Jeroboam's rebellion. And so Lightheart writes, "The structure of the speech replicates the political order of Israel. Yahweh is the ultimate guarantor and guardian of the Davidic kingdom. He stands with us at the boundary of the land as the God who gave rule to David." The absence of a B prime is notable. Jeroboam is not a legitimate king. His kingdom is founded on rebellion. At the center of the speech is the contrast of priesthoods. The order replicates the arrangement of the genealogy, with Judah at the beginning, Benjamin, another royal tribe, at the end, and the Levites at the center. The chronicler is once again drawing pictures with words, and we noted this last time that you also had that same structure which mirrored the genealogies of chapters 2 through 8 specifically. And continuing with Lightheart, he says, Abijah sees Jeroboam as a counterfeit David. And this is really interesting because this is what Abijah's speech is doing. He repeatedly is going to use a language that is reminiscent of David being established and made strong and things like that. But Jeroboam is like an anti-David. And continuing with Lightheart, he says, David also gathered men around him. Compare verse 1 of chapter 11 of 1 Chronicles. But David gathered honorable and valiant warriors. Jeroboam's company is full of sons of Belial. These sons of Belial take advantage of Rehoboam's youth and timidity to wrest the kingdom from him. David had a lord, Saul, but did not rebel against him. Jeroboam has not learned this lesson, or his lesson. By making war on Abijah, he continues the rebellion against David and against Yahweh. And so even if you were going to make an argument that Jeroboam maybe had some legitimacy to be opposed to Rehoboam, the fact that he's continuing to rebel now against Abijah just shows that it's really not about Rehoboam specifically. It's about the Davidic kingship. And by extension, it's against Yahweh. But continuing with Lightheart, he says, this is not an accidental or inadvertent sin. Abijah claims that Jeroboam and Israel know all this. It is high-handed rebellion. Israel forsakes Yahweh by forsaking David's house. Hear, O Israel, Abijah says, return to Yahweh by returning to the house of David. And of course, they're not going to do this. They are going to engage in this battle, in this war. And concerning the covenant of salt language in this section, John Stone and others note the sacrificial ritual elements to salt. It's what was used in sacrifices, really to draw out the blood. It was part of a preservative, but it also took any of the blood out because you weren't supposed to partake in the blood, things like that. But anytime you have this covenant of salt kind of language, you have part of that. There's other things going on in that, but it has sacrificial language undergirding it whenever you see it. And Johnstone's going to pick up, again, similarly, how Abijah is portraying Jeroboam as the antithesis of David. So this gathered themselves to him is the way Johnstone puts it. But he says it's the same verb used in 1 Chronicles 11:1 for those who gathered to support David. Only this time it is empty men of the worthless class, sons of Belial, again, worthless scoundrels or whatever the ESV says. They then encouraged one another against Rehoboam. Again, that's the way he translates this, but the verb chosen is the intensive reflexive of the verb of encouragement used by David to Solomon. And we get it elsewhere, also in 2 Chronicles 11:17. Rehoboam was too young and tenderhearted to pit himself against them. The verb takes up the standard verb of the Davidic king establishing himself, or of the kingdom being established thanks to him. And so throughout this little section, you have so many verbal links back to the establishment of David. And Jeroboam is seeking to undo that establishment. And moving on to verse 8, and now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David, because you are a great multitude, and have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made you for gods. So, John Stone, Abijah then turns to address the northern army directly, with scorn and rebuke. Now you are planning to pit yourselves against the kingdom of God in the hand of the sons of David. The choice of expression in that last phrase is as far-reaching as 1 Chronicles 28:5, where the throne of David is equated with the throne of God. The kingdom is God's kingdom. Revolt against the Davidic king is revolt against God. And I think that this is a foreshadowing of, and it's foreshadowed also in the Psalms, like Psalm 2, for instance, where a Davidic descendant, the son of David, the Messiah, is actually going to also be the Son of God. He's going to be identified directly with God. So to oppose the Son of David in the messianic sense is literally to oppose God. And so there you're going to have those fused directly in the person of Jesus Christ. But here you have it in the sense of the Davidic descendants. And as he puts it here, that they're trying to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David. So he's making that link between the two. And so this is not a minor mistake that Jeroboam is making. He's opposing God himself. And continuing on with his speech, he points out that they've basically cast out the Levites and appoint anybody. They have this ordination language, which is literally to fill the hand. We encountered this in First Chronicles, the end of First Chronicles. But basically anybody can pay to become a priest in this system that they've set up. And so they've essentially cast off the Levitical Aaronic priesthood and driven out the priests. And picking up with Johnstone, he says, here again is the vocabulary of rejection from the semantic field of ma'al. The verb to expel is used once again in Chronicles, in chapter 21, verse 11, for it refers to Jehoram's actions in driving Judah away from the worship of the Lord. In so doing, the northern kingdom has forfeited its status as part of the people of Israel. They have become, in a significant phrase, like the peoples of the lands. They have become conformed to the world of the nations, the transforming of which was their vocation. So in this twist of irony, they become like the nations, which they were called to be a light to those nations, but now they become just like them. And we'll skip down to verse 14. And when Judah looked, behold, the battle was in front of and behind them. And they cried to the Lord, and the priests blew the trumpets. Then the men of Judah raised the battle shout. And when the men of Judah shouted, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. So after he gives his speech, they're surrounded and they then engage in battle. But what's interesting is this shouting and the trumpets. This is reminiscent of Jericho in Joshua 6, as well as the crying out that you get in Exodus 14 before the crossing of the Red Sea. You also have this language in 1 Chronicles 5:20. So Lightheart points out that when Judah advances to face Israel, the ambush comes out behind them, and the warriors of Judah are stuck in the middle, surrounded by armies of Israel. It is the kind of strategy that worked at Ai and in other battles, but it does not work here. The people of Judah cry out, like the Israelites in Egypt or at the Red Sea. The priests sound those trumpets, summoning God to draw near to rescue them. Yahweh routs Jeroboam and gives Israel into the hands of Abijah, and Abijah's army kills 500,000 of the men of Israel. They trust in Yahweh and win a great victory. They defeat Jeroboam with cries and trumpets. And similarly, Johnstone says, the realization of victory is therefore a matter of invoking the power of God. The trumpets once blown on the field of battle and blown at the installation of the ark have only to be blown now to actualize that victory already won. The overwhelming blast of the trumpets sounded against the north, announcing the arrival of God on the field of battle, is enough to spread panic and force submission. And Johnstone also notes here that you have this language of defeated, the way the ESV translates it. It's the language of smiting, and it's used in 1 Chronicles 21, where David takes the failed census and a plague comes about them. But of course, that itself was a type of the Passover. And so that smiting language we also saw in Exodus. And so once again, we kind of have this negative Passover, except again, it's the armies of Israel that have become the enemies of God. In verse 19 and following, and Abijah pursued Jeroboam and took the cities from him, Bethel with its villages and so on and so forth. I want to note here that one of these locations, obviously, they take is Bethel, which is significant in the Old Testament, but especially significant here is this is where the golden calves were set up by Jeroboam. But immediately this locale falls to Judah in the north. And so once again, kind of in that Exodus motif, you have the gods of the other nations being shamed and defeated. Except, of course, here the bitter irony is that it's Israel that is fighting under the banner of these false gods. And the final verses, verse 21 and following, but Abijah grew mighty, and he took 14 wives and had 22 sons and 16 daughters. The rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways, and his sayings are written in the story of the prophet Iddo. Now, remember, we talked about the 3-year reign. So it was a very short reign, and kings looked at him rather negatively, that is Abijah. And so this one story where he's very faithful, seemingly, seems a bit at odds. But Johnstone, commenting on this large group of wives that he had, remember, this is forbidden for kings. They were not supposed to multiply wives, yet we see them doing it over and over. And here Johnston says the remaining verse 21, on his extensive harem may stand duty for the evaluation of the reign and explain why, despite his exemplary trust, Abijah's reign was so short. And Johnstone also says, towards the end of his discussion, the abrupt switch from being established to acting foolishly is paralleled, for example, in 2 Chronicles 18:1. And that's Jehoshaphat. Again, you have the same thing where it's like he's established and then immediately acts foolishly. In that case, it's a marriage alliance with Ahab's daughter. But Johnstone continues, an implied negative judgment would match the negative evaluation given for Abijah in 1 Kings 15:3. And here he has the alternate name. So in Kings, he is called Abijah Mean. In Abijah would be, my father is Yah, or Jah, like Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever. This, however, would be Yam, is sea. So my father is Yam. And presumably, though, not the generic ocean, but the sea god, Yam. But you'll see this actually quite a bit with the names. But perhaps this note here about his multiple wives is the negative judgment on him. So even though he was faithful in this particular episode, overall, those marriage alliances would have happened over time. So overall, he wasn't faithful. But in this particular case, he was. And his rebuke of Jeroboam was valid. And he ultimately weakened Jeroboam in this engagement. But nevertheless, he only reigned 3 years. And now chapter 14, Abijah passes away, is buried, and Asa, his son, is going to reign in his place. And things are largely going to go well with Asa for a while. But spoiler alert, he's going to squander it at the end of his life. But the early part of his reign is really emphasized by peace and rest. And as Hahn writes here in his commentary, that is pointing out this rest and peace, it's pointed out 5 times. This rest and peace are presented as the fruits of the people's faithful seeking of the Lord. Asa declares, the land is still ours because we have sought the Lord our God. We have sought him, and he has given us peace on every side. And remember, this seeking language was what Saul failed to do. This language harkens back to God's covenant promises concerning Solomon. I will give him peace from all his enemies round about, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. It's 1 Chronicles 22:9. These promises in turn point back to Deuteronomy, where Moses pledged that rest would be the inheritance of God's covenant people. Asa is the first of several new Solomon figures in the Chronicles royal history. And Lightheart here is noting this juxtaposing chiastic structure between the sections here with Asa. And specifically, they're juxtaposed on these 2 wars, and they parallel in structure, but they highlight Asa's contrasting responses. So the first time Asa hears and obeys, the second time he's going to respond very poorly to the words of the prophet. But you can see they parallel very nicely here. So you have the purging of idolatry. Down here you have the covenant renewal. B, you have war. B prime, again, war again. C, oracle from Oded. C prime, an oracle from Hanani. D, Asa hears. D prime, Asa imprisons the prophet and dies from a foot disease. And so let's just start taking apart his reign. Verse 3, he took away the foreign altars in the high places and broke down the pillars and cut down the Asherim and commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandment. Lightheart has an interesting note here. He says that verse 3 is an 8-word clause describing the purge. 3 verbs are used: remove, tear, and cut, terms that have some resonance with the actions of sacrifice. And then 4 objects are destroyed: altars, high places, pillars, and Asherim. And Dillard, in his commentary, is going to get a little bit into the weeds here, because we have the statement that he removed the foreign altars and high places. But at the end of 15, you have that he did not remove the high places from Israel. So there's question about this. there's a number of suggestions, but one is you do have this over a period of roughly 40 years. And so you have an early statement in verse 2 and then a later statement. And so perhaps this is a recurring issue. The problems with this view, though, are the fact that many people actually think that what happens in the next chapter, in 15, with the reforms, is actually just an expansion of what happened in verse 2. So verse 2 is just a statement, and then chapter 15 actually kind of goes into more detail. Of course, these reforms would have taken place over a long period of time. That point would still stand, but it may not resolve the tension. I think much more likely is option 2 here, that it does have the phrase from Israel. So if you look at both phrases next to each other, verse 2 says that he removed the high places and all of these things from Judah. Verse 17 of chapter 15, it says that he did not remove the high places from Israel. Of course, at this point, Israel has become its own thing. And so that might be what's going on here, is Judah is its own separate thing from Israel. And so he removed the idolatrous places from Judah, which he controlled, but the places in Israel, obviously he didn't control, he didn't remove. Or there's also the possibility that some of what came over to him from the last conflict with Abijah, some of those northern territories, maybe he didn't actually purge all of those places of idolatry, which is kind of funny to me because it reminds me a little bit of the issue of Abraham Lincoln. Famously, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which quote unquote freed the slaves. Now, if you know anything about that, the reality is it really didn't free the slaves. What he did is he freed the slaves in the South, specifically though in locations they didn't control. Those places were under dispute. And in fact, some of the southern places that Lincoln had control over, he went out of his way to exclude from the proclamation. And so it was kind of an empty political gesture. In fact, he was criticized by both Americans as well as Europeans over this blatant political move because it didn't actually free any slaves. In the places he could have, he didn't for political reasons. But it does kind of make me wonder that maybe Asa did that here in this case, that he did purge in Judah the high places, which is good. He should be commended for that. But perhaps in the places in quote unquote Israel, which is some of the northern sites that were now under his control, maybe he didn't purge those places, even though he could have. But who knows? But I do think that this option, though, is the better of the two, that Israel is his own thing and Judah is its own thing. So he did remove the high places from Judah, but not from Israel. And John Stone points out here that this seek the Lord language, the thematic term, as in 1 Chronicles 10, 13 through 14, is the opposite of the thematic term ma'al, the defrauding of God. And we pointed this out. I mean, this is what Saul failed to do here, is seek the Lord, and what he actually did was ma'al. He defrauded the Lord. He committed this trespass, or however that's going to be translated. And we will move down to verse 5. And he also took out all the cities of Judah, the high places, and the incense altars, and the kingdom had rest under him. He built fortified cities in Judah, for the land had rest. He had no war in those years, for the Lord gave him peace. And Dillard is pointing out here that incense altars, that it used to be translated as sun pillar in some older translations, though more recent archaeological data had achieved some consensus to translate incense altars. The term is still debated, Williamson, Myers, but Klein actually points out that Milgram argues that this terminology here suggests that they were cult objects set on the altar, which is compatible with an interpretation of them as incense stands or incense altars. So it was something that was put on an altar. Klein points out here that it's not clear whether this is the same ones referred to in verse 3 or different ones. And then he asks, were the earlier ones high places dedicated to other gods, while the ones in this verse were Yahwistic? And I thought this was interesting. Johnstone points this out. For the land had rest. Under that language, he says, the wording of verse 6 is striking because the land is at peace and the Lord has given rest. Works to strengthen the defense of the realm are undertaken. So it's because it's at rest that they begin to fortify it. And Lightheart points out here that Asa fortified the cities. The land is again said to be undisturbed. Shakat for a third time. The verb is used repeatedly in Judges and typically refers to the tranquility that descends on a land during the lifetime of a judge. It has a similar connotation in Chronicles. But after this piece that is discussed, we get to verse 9. Zerah the Ethiopian came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots, and came as far as Marashah. And Asa went out to meet him, and they drew up their lines of battle in the valley of Zephathah at Marashah. Now, there's actually a lot of discussion over Zerah, and many have tried to connect him to Egypt in some way, specifically with Osorkon I, who I believe was the son of Shishak, maybe grandson, I don't remember. You'll often read that he was perhaps just some kind of Nubian general under Osorkon, or maybe he was kind of the general of some garrison that was left behind as like a buffer state after Shishak's invasion. But other commentators note that Egypt is never mentioned in this passage, and so they look elsewhere, and they think that perhaps he was some kind of like a war chief of a group of Bedouins, and that this is some kind of skirmish between these people. But Lightheart and Johnstone take a very different perspective, and one that I think actually yields a lot of interesting things, especially typologically. So we'll go ahead and take a look at what they say. And again, Ethiopian is actually Cushite. So Cush is the father of Nimrod. This is Lightheart, the first warrior to spread chaos through the world of nations. Zerah's rise represents a primordial threat to the order that God conceived for relations between himself and human society. Zerah bears a Hebrew name, one who springs up, which may indicate that he sprang up from within Judah. Though surrounded by a Cushite army, Zerah may be an insurrectionist rather than an invader. Perhaps we are looking at a repetition of the reign of Rehoboam, who was opposed by a domestic enemy who had sojourned in Egypt. The original Zerah is one of the sons of Judah, the putative firstborn who was displaced by the breakthrough of Judah's younger son Perez. And that's what Perez basically means. The chronicler has played on the genealogical link between David and Perez in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16. And perhaps he is highlighting the same here. If you remember during this section, and actually even going further back into chapter 13, that breakthrough language was used throughout this section with David, the Ark of the Covenant, things like that. But continuing on, Zerah may be a Judahite pretender who wants to seize the kingship back from the upstart Perizzite Asa. And Lightheart is going to note here the chiastic structures to the following narratives. He points out that Yahweh, his name is used 7 times in this battle, in this section. You can pause here if you want to look at the chiasms. We're going to push through. I want to get to Johnstone, who, again, a lot of what Lightheart was building on was Johnstone's observations. And so Johnstone writes that geographically the Cushites come from Nubia. They are listed with Egypt among the sons of Ham in 1 Chronicles 1:8. But more importantly, archetypally, Cush is the father of Nimrod, the first warrior to spread chaos through the world of the nations. Here is a recrudescence, I think that means like recurring, of the primordial threat to the order that God conceived for relations between himself and human society. Zerah, the leader of the invaders, bears a Hebrew name meaning arising, presumably from the soil, that is, a native. Here it may be meant to indicate an insurrectionist. And so I actually prefer this explanation over the ones that connect him with Egypt directly or whatever, because it never mentions Egypt in the section. But continuing on, verse 11, and Asa cried to the Lord his God, O Lord, there is none like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you. So the Lord defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. In Klein's commentary, he interacts here with Japhet, that there is none except you to help in a conflict between the strong and the weak. That's the way she translates it. Clearly, Asa views Zerah and his host as mighty, and Judah and himself as weak. Asa's petition is to the point, help us, and is followed by two reasons for Yahweh to act. We rely on you, and in your name we have come against this host, which kind of is reminiscent of David and Goliath, the language that David uses there. And again, Judah wins this battle, relying on God. And immediately after this, on their way back to Jerusalem, it begins here in chapter 15. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. And Johnstone here is pointing out actually the section starts at verse 8 of 14 and actually is going to continue through chapter 15. So we really should continue reading chapter 15 as not necessarily a new instance, a new section. So it continues right after the battle into Asa's speech with them. But Asa means the Lord has helped, picking up the verb used in Asa's petition in verse 11 of chapter 14. And once again, to the point here, Johnstone points out here that the fundamental sacral principle at the outset with all clarity, the Lord is with you, the messianic preposition. When you are with him, if you seek him, again, our key term, he will be found by you. If you forsake him, he will forsake you. By unreserved commitment to God, Israel becomes what she is intended to be. Any failure is by that failure to forfeit that status. And so this is what's laid before the people of God throughout Chronicles over and over. Seek the Lord and he will be found. Forsake him and he will forsake you. And moving down to verse 5, in those times there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for great disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. And Johnstone points out a pun here in verse 5, this great disturbances language, and the next verse in verse 6, which goes back to verse 11 of chapter 14 with this great multitude or horde that came against them. And in verse 7, but you take courage, do not let your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. I especially want to highlight this latter phrase because we've seen this take heart kind of language, as Johnstone's pointing out, 1 Chronicles 22:13. It's this being established kind of language. But this phrase here about being rewarded, Johnstone writes, the last phrase coincides with Jeremiah 31:16. The cross-reference is highly apt. In Jeremiah, it expresses the expectation of return and restoration of the deportees of the northern kingdom after exile. The same thought is not far distant here. It is part of the mission of Judah to re-establish the united kingdom of Israel under the one Davidic ruler. In that task, Judah will need all the perseverance it can muster. In verse 9, and he gathered all Judah and Benjamin and those from Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon who were residing with them, for great numbers had deserted to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with them. And once again, this gathered language is a callback to 1 Chronicles 11:1 specifically. In verse 14 and following, they swear an oath to the Lord with a loud voice and with shouting and with trumpets and with horns, and they rejoiced over this oath. But there's actually going to be something of a cruel irony in this immediately following this, that they have peace and they make this covenant, this oath with the Lord, because it's about to go downhill here in a moment. But down to verse 16, even Maacah, his mother, King Asa removed from being queen mother because she had made a detestable image for Asherah. Asa cut down her image, crushed it, and burned it in the brook Kidron. And Johnstone writes that the king's mother seems to have played a vital role in the transition of the rule from father to son. Therefore, she appears to have retained honorific status as queen mother. It is therefore a striking breach of etiquette, and perhaps even a threat to his own position, given the other possible claimants to the throne, that Asa should remove his own mother from her position. It is a powerful statement of his priorities, His power base lies fundamentally in his religious orthodoxy, not in court arrangements or intrigues. Maacah forfeits her position because she has been instrumental in setting up a statue to the female consorts of Baal. This object doubly objectionable, both in itself as an idol and as an encouragement to a rival theological system, Asa cuts down, crushed, and burns in the Kidron Valley, presumably as a means of conveying away in the stream the polluting influence. What's interesting about this, too, about what he does, I'd be curious if there's any further linguistic connections, but it reminds me of the golden calf episode, which itself has hooks into the Numbers 5 jealousy inspection. That's really its own video. So just very briefly, though, some of the elements that are involved is this writing down of the sins, and then you take dust from the temple, you put it in this drink, and you were supposed to drink it. The woman that's suspected of adultery. In the episode with the golden calf, when Moses comes down, he destroys the golden calf, and he grounds it basically into dust, pours it in water, and he makes the people drink it, which is this super odd detail, but it seems to connect to the jealousy inspection in Numbers 5. And there are other typological jealousy inspections. In fact, even the Lord's Supper, I think, could be seen under this idea as well. But the fact that he crushes it is an interesting element. I wonder if there isn't something going on there. And then verse 17 and following, but the high places were not taken out of Israel. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true all his days. And he brought into the house of God the sacred gifts of his father and his own sacred gifts, silver and gold and vessels. And there was no more war until the 35th year of the reign of Asa. And like the covenants that I mentioned before, becoming kind of a bitter, cruel irony, this is as well that he brings in these sacred gifts in his own gifts, silver, gold, so on and so forth. But again, we already discussed this Israel language, which Johnstone similarly is picking up, that the idea may be neatly solved by adding from Israel, that is the north. But Johnstone writes, the notice then gives additional grounds for elevating Asa's theological orthodoxy. His heart was sound, again the pun with Solomon, all his days over against the apostate north. And he's referring here to this, the heart of Asa was wholly true. And this flows us directly into chapter 16, where in the 36th year of the reign of Asa, Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. So he basically creates a blockade. Then Asa took silver and gold from the treasures of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and sent them to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, who lived in Damascus, saying, there is a covenant between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. And like I said, the silver, gold, the vessels, as well as the covenant that they just cut with the Lord again. Here you have Asa now giving silver and gold from the house of the Lord, from the temple, as well as his own treasuries. He's sending them over to Ben-Hadad, and he's making a covenant with him. And so Johnstone says, to hire this help, he has to raid not only his own treasury, but the temple treasury itself. Nothing could more dramatically express Asa's abject failure to trust in the validity of his own theological system. The very holy things that have just been dedicated in verse 18 of the last chapter, in recognition that it is God who delivered him from the Cushites, are now paid as an inducement to another foreign king to come and rescue him. And even worse is who he sends it to. He sends it to Ben-Hadad. Johnstone says, the Aramean king's name, Ben-Hadad, adds theological point. Baal, the term for the Canaanite god most frequently referred to in the Hebrew Bible, is the chief rival of the Lord, is in fact merely a title itself meaning Lord. So Baal just generically means Lord. And Baal's interesting because Baal basically gets absorbed later by, like Zeus, for instance. And of course, you later get like Beelzebub and Beelzebul. And so there's a sense in which Baal is connected also basically with Satan, with the devil. But continuing with Johnstone, he says the proper name of the deity who bore this title was Hadad. The Aramean king's name means then son of Hadad. Theologically, his position as ruler of Damascus is exactly analogous to that of the Davidic house in Jerusalem as the son of the Lord. Compare Psalm 2:7, 1 Chronicles 17:13. Again, nothing can make the clash of theological systems plainer. And he's absolutely right. Again, especially if you are going to connect Baal with a more or less satanic or demonic power. Again, specifically, you do have things that would kind of connect Baal to more or less Satan. And that he's going to the son of Hadad is a massive failure. And Lightheart makes an interesting point. The text reads, "Behold, I am sending you silver and gold. Go break your covenant with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me." But this language, that he may withdraw from me, is interesting. Lightheart writes, "The chronicler does not explicitly charge Asa with Ma'al, but Asa all but confesses it. When he sends the money to Ben-Hadad, Asa says that he wants Baasha to ascend from over me." That's the way Lightheart translates it. The Hebrew is a pun on Ma'al. And again, we've seen this kind of punning language between Ma'al and some of this ascension type language. And so what is asking for contains itself a pun of Ma'al. And so it brings this kind of failure to mind. And Johnstone, similarly, is going to point out that Asa sinks deeper into the mire. Having just sealed a covenant with God in 5:12, he now requests a covenant with Ben-Hadad, the only time in Chronicles that covenant is used in a secular context. He not only makes a covenant on his own behalf, but also, somewhat strangely, on his father's behalf, or perhaps appeals to a long-standing agreement of which we otherwise know nothing. He implicates the earlier generations of the Davidic house in his action, and thereby cedes their right to rule on earth, to be the Lord's vice-regents. So it's basically giving sovereignty over to someone else. And this is basically what Hanani is going to charge against Asa. And so picking up in verse 7, "At that time Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, Because you relied on the king of Syria, and did not rely on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria has escaped you. Were not the Ethiopians and the Libyans a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. You have done foolishly in this, for from now on you will have wars." And this is going to set off Asa and is going to put him in the stocks. And Johnstone says, he delivers a two-part message: rebuke for the actions just taken, and prediction of war as a necessary consequence of these actions. Hanani's message is based on the stark choice focused in Chronicles' key term, to rely. Unconditional reliance on the Lord ensures the preservation of the peace that God's cosmic victory has already won. Failure to rely inevitably brings forfeiture of that peace. In specific terms, Asa has relied on the Arameans. And I thought this was pretty interesting. So in this statement, he says how the Lord's eyes go to and fro, and he gives strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him, which is the way the ESV puts it. Johnstone says, Hanani's message contains a remarkable statement about the worldwide dominion of God, which Asa, as his vice-regent, should have known, trusted in, and sought to realize. God's eyes range over the whole earth, so that every ruler whose heart is in tune with him is established. In the ESV here as whose heart is blameless toward him. And Johnstone translates that as in tune with. Two key words are used here. In tune is related to the word for peace, ironically just used of Asa himself. Is established is the standard term for the confirmation of the Davidic king in his kingdom. Here in the ESV it's translated as give strong support. Continuing with Johnstone, the establishment of the other kings of the nations in their proper places is no less a reflection of the universal rule of God. They too are his subjects, destined for peace, but they are ready also to be his agents against his own people for punishment, should that people fail in their task. Hanani speaks with all directness. Asa should have known better. He has been a fool. To denote his foolishness, he uses the same word as David has used of himself in 1 Chronicles 21:8, the only other occurrence of the root in Chronicles. And very interestingly enough, First Chronicles 21 is the census that David takes, where he doesn't rely on God's promises to make the people uncountable. And so he tries to know their number. He tries to count his soldiers. He wants to know his military might instead of relying on the might of God. And he suffers for it. And here you see Asa doing basically the same thing, and both are called fools for this. And then moving down to verse 12, in the 39th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. And again, here you have the seeking language, and very much like Saul, he doesn't seek the Lord anymore. And Asa slept with his fathers, dying in the 41st year of his reign. They buried him in the tomb that he had cut for himself in the city of David. They laid him on a bier that had been filled with various kinds of spices prepared by the perfumer's art, and they made a very great fire in his honor. And Johnstone here points out that the language here of feet, you may or may not know this. This is one of those curiosities in the Bible that feet is not always, but it's used euphemistically at times for the private parts. So, of course, there's discussion about that perhaps not so much like an STD, but perhaps this illness had some kind of sexual connotation to it. Maybe, but maybe it was literally just the feet. But I actually do favor the euphemism. And Johnstone also picks up on this language here. The ESV says that the disease became severe. And Johnstone says that Chronicles adds that his illness was severe. Le Malah. Again, perhaps a pun on Ma'al, as in 1 Chronicles 14:2. And again, Johnstone is noting the fact that he did not seek the Lord, the source of his affliction. He consults the physicians, healers, derived from a root that Chronicles uses elsewhere of restoration to the intended condition in constructing his theological pattern. And here he lists a number of references. Asa, and he questions whether that means he heals, should have known better the source of health. Indeed, one may assume that Chronicles' view is that had Asa been faithful, he would not have fallen ill in the first place, but he would have died like David in ripe old age. And so Asa continues our theme of these kings wavering in their trust. But that is chapters 13 through 16, and we will pick up in chapter 17 next time.